For most of human history, a father was a ghost in the machine of biology. You are standing in a torch-lit cave 30,000 years ago, watching a woman scream through the final stages of labor. When the child finally arrives, covered in the red evidence of its origin, every person in that small band looks at the infant and then looks at the men standing in the shadows. They are looking for a nose, a jawline, or a specific tilt of the eyes. They are searching for a connection that, in this era, is completely invisible. The mother's connection to the child is a visceral, undeniable fact of nature. She is the one who carried it, the one who birthed it, and the one whose body will now sustain it. But the man? For him, the link is purely theoretical. In the deep past, the most powerful leader of a tribe had less proof of his paternity than a common stray dog. This was the fundamental glitch in the human operating system. It was a biological silence that lasted for 300 millennia, and the ways our ancestors tried to fill that silence shaped every single law, religion, and social custom you live under today. Imagine the sheer physical danger of this uncertainty. If you are a male in a world of scarce resources, why would you share your hard-earned mammoth meat with a mouth that doesn't carry your genetic code? To evolution, that isn't just a mistake, it's a terminal error. This is the invisible chain that connects every generation, but for the vast majority of our time on this planet, that chain was made of glass. We like to think that ancient humans lived in simple, nuclear families like a prehistoric version of a sitcom, but that is a comforting myth we've projected onto a much weirder reality. The idea that one man and one woman stayed together in a state of perfect, verifiable fidelity is a very recent invention, and it's one that our ancestors would have found practically impossible to enforce. Before the advent of blood tests and DNA swabs, paternity wasn't a biological fact. It was a social negotiation. It was a story the tribe agreed to tell itself so that the group wouldn't tear itself apart. This brings us to the first great myth we have to dismantle: the idea that ancient humans even understood the mechanics of fatherhood. We assume that because the cause and effect of sex and pregnancy are obvious to us, they were always obvious. But consider the timeline. There is a 9-month gap between the act and the result. In a world without calendars, where life was a blur of migration and survival, connecting a specific moment of intimacy in the spring to a birth in the midwinter was not a simple task. Anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski famously observed the Trobriand Islanders in the early 20th century and found a culture that genuinely believed children were spirit babies that entered the mother while she was bathing or dreaming. In their view, the man played no biological role in the creation of the child, he was merely a guardian. While some modern researchers argue Malinowski might have misunderstood the nuances of their beliefs, the core truth remains that many ancient societies didn't view paternity as a singular, binary event. They viewed it as something shared. The invisible chain of paternity was often spread across multiple men to ensure the child's survival. In lowland South America, specifically among groups like the Ache of Paraguay, a concept called partible paternity was the norm. These people believed that a child was literally built out of the biological contributions of every man the mother had sex with during her pregnancy. One man might provide the essence for the head, another for the limbs, and another for the strength. Far from being a source of conflict, this was a brilliant survival strategy. In a study by researchers Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado, they found that children with multiple recognized fathers had significantly higher survival rates. Because when a child has 3 or 4 men who all believe they are at least partially responsible for its existence, that child has 3 or 4 protectors bringing back meat and defending it from predators. The danger of uncertainty was neutralized by leaning into it. They didn't try to find the one true father, they simply invited more men to hold the chain. But as the human story moved forward, that invisible chain began to tighten around the neck of social order. As soon as we stopped wandering and started planting crops, the stakes of paternity changed forever. In a hunter-gatherer band, you don't own much more than your spear and your reputation. But in an agricultural society, you own land, grain, and livestock. You have a legacy. This transition created a biological panic that defines the middle act of human history. If you are going to spend 40 years breaking your back to build a farm, you want to be damn sure that the person inheriting it is actually your genetic offspring. This is where the physical danger of paternity shifted from the child's survival to the mother's freedom. To guarantee the invisible chain was intact, societies began to build walls. This wasn't just a social change, it was a biological arms race. Evolutionary psychologist Gordon Gallup Jr. published a startling study in 2003 that suggested the very shape of the human anatomy might be a relic of this ancient paternity war. He theorized that the human gland's penis is shaped the way it is, specifically the ridge around the head, to act as a vacuum or a displacement tool. The idea is that it evolved to physically remove the semen of any rival males that might have been present shortly before. It's a haunting thought that our very bodies are designed to fight a war of paternity on a microscopic level because our minds had no way of knowing the truth. We were carving the answers into our flesh because we couldn't find them in the light of day. When anatomy wasn't enough, we turned to the mirror. We became obsessed with resemblance. You've seen it at every baby shower you've ever attended, the way people immediately declare that the newborn has his father's chin or his father's eyes. This isn't just polite small talk, it's a deep-seated survival ritual. In 1995, researchers Nicholas Christenfeld and Emily Hill conducted a study to see if infants actually resemble their fathers more than their mothers. They found that, remarkably, strangers were better at matching one-year-olds to their fathers than to their mothers. The theory is that evolution may have selected for babies who look like their dads as a paternity assurance mechanism. If a baby looks exactly like the man who is supposed to be providing for it, that man is much less likely to abandon it or, in extreme cases, kill it. The invisible chain was being forged out of the very features of the child's face. But the mirror is a fickle thing. Anyone who has ever been told they look like a distant relative they've never met knows that resemblance is subjective. Ancient humans knew this too, so they moved from the mirror to the law. This is where the direct question of paternity became a matter of life and death. The Code of Hammurabi, written nearly 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, is obsessed with this. Section 129 states that if a wife is caught with another man, they shall both be bound and thrown into the water. Why such a brutal penalty? It wasn't about morality in the way we think of it today. It was about property rights. An adulterous wife didn't just break a vow. She threatened the entire system of inheritance. She introduced a cuckoo into the nest, a child who would eventually inherit the wealth and status of a man who wasn't its father. To the ancient state, this was a form of high-stakes fraud that could collapse a dynasty. The invisible chain was now being reinforced with iron and stone. In ancient Rome, the law of pater est quem nuptiae demonstrant, the father is he whom the marriage points to, became the standard. This was a legal fiction designed to ignore the biological reality entirely. The Romans were practical. They knew they couldn't prove who the father was, so they simply decreed that if a man was married to the mother, he was the father, end of story. This didn't stop the anxiety. It just drove it underground. Roman literature is filled with jokes and tragedies about men who look at their children and see the face of the local gladiator or the neighbor's slave. They had the law, but they didn't have the truth, and that lack of truth created a persistent, low-grade fever of paranoia that infected every level of their society. This paranoia eventually led to the most extreme measures in human history, the total sequestration of women. If you cannot know for certain who the father is, the only logical solution, from a cold, evolutionary property rights perspective, is to ensure that no other male ever has access to the female. This is the origin of the harem, the veil, and the chaperone. It is the reason why, for thousands of years, women in many cultures were forbidden from speaking to men who weren't their relatives. We often frame these customs as religious, but at their core, they are biological firewalls. They were the only way to make the invisible chain visible. By controlling every second of a woman's life, a man could finally feel a modicum of certainty that his legacy was his own. It was a high price to pay for a piece of information that we now get from a $20 kit at the drugstore. But even with all the walls and all the laws, the uncertainty remained. Evolution is far more clever than any legal code. While men were trying to lock down paternity, nature was providing mothers with a counter-strategy. Evolutionary biologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy argued that paternity uncertainty was actually an incredible tool for female survival. In many primate species, when a new male takes over a troop, he kills all the infants that aren't his so the females will go back into heat. This is the Cinderella effect on a lethal scale. HRDY suggested that by mating with multiple males, a female creates a diluted paternity. If 5 different males think there is a 20% chance the baby is theirs, none of them will kill it. Uncertainty wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. It was a shield that protected the most vulnerable members of our species from the violent impulses of the strongest. This leads us to the most counterintuitive wow fact in the history of this mystery. We spent 300,000 years trying to solve the problem of the invisible chain, but the uncertainty itself might be what made us human. Because men couldn't be 100% sure of their paternity, they couldn't afford to be purely selfish. They had to cooperate. They had to build social structures that protected all children, just in case. The very concept of the tribe, or the community, is, in a way, a response to the fact that we didn't know exactly who belonged to whom. We had to care for the collective because the individual link was too fragile to rely on. The invisible chain didn't just connect a father to a son, it wove a web that held the entire group together. The invisible chain was finally made visible in 1984. That was the year Sir Alec Jeffreys developed DNA profiling at the University of Leicester. Suddenly, the 300,000-year-old mystery was over. In a matter of hours, a scientist could look at a sequence of base pairs and tell you, with a 99.9% certainty, exactly whose blood was flowing through that child's veins. It was the greatest information revolution in the history of our species, but it came with a heavy cost. When we gained the truth, we lost the flexibility that had defined human social life since the Stone Age. We can no longer rely on the spirit baby myths or the legal fictions of the Romans. We are now forced to face the biological reality, and that reality is often much messier than the stories we told ourselves to survive. Recent data from modern paternity tests has revealed a startling truth. Non-paternity rates, where the presumed father is not the biological father, hover between 1% and 3% in most stable populations, but can spike much higher in different social contexts. That means in a stadium of 50,000 people, there are at least 500 to 1,500 people who are wrong about the very identity of their ancestors. Before 1984, those people would have lived and died never knowing the truth, their lives held together by the social glue of social paternity. Now, that glue is being dissolved by the cold light of genetics. We have traded the protective shield of uncertainty for the sharp, sometimes cold edge of the truth. The invisible chain has become a laser-mapped map. We can now trace our paternal lineage back to a single man who lived in Africa roughly 250,000 years ago, the Y-chromosomal Adam. Every single male on this planet carries a piece of that one man's code. For 250,000 years, that code was a secret. It was passed from hand to hand in the dark, through wars, migrations, and the rise and fall of empires. The men carrying it had no idea it was there. They fought over resemblance, they killed over infidelity, and they built civilizations to protect a legacy they could only guess at. They were obsessed with the chain precisely because they couldn't see it. The danger of knowing is just as real as the danger of not knowing. Today, paternity tests are used in child support battles, immigration cases, and inheritance disputes. They have become a tool of the state, much like the Code of Hammurabi, but with a level of precision that Hammurabi could never have dreamed of. But as we use this technology to settle our legal scores, we have to wonder what we've lost. The Ache of Paraguay, with their multiple fathers, had a higher survival rate for their children because they didn't let biology get in the way of care. They understood that a father isn't just a source of DNA, he's a source of meat, protection, and teaching. By making the chain visible, we've made it more brittle. We've turned a social bond into a chemical one. Look back at that torchlit cave. The man looking at the newborn doesn't have a DNA kit. He doesn't have a legal code. All he has is a feeling, a flicker of recognition in the curve of a tiny ear or the way the infant grips his thumb. He chooses to believe. He chooses to pick up the spear and go back out into the cold to find food for a child that might not be his. That choice is the most human thing about us. It is the triumph of social will over biological uncertainty. For 99% of our history, being a father was an act of faith, not a result of a test. We have spent our entire existence trying to solve the riddle of the invisible chain. We built religions to sanctify it, we built laws to enforce it, and we built machines to measure it. But the more we learn about the ancient world, the more we realize that the riddle wasn't meant to be solved. It was meant to be lived. The uncertainty was the forge that created the human family. It forced us to trust, to negotiate, and to look beyond the cold facts of biology to the warmer truths of commitment and community. We thought we were looking for a father, but we were actually building a society. The paradox of our modern age is that we have finally found the answer, but the answer has made us more lonely. In the past, paternity was a shared mystery that required the whole tribe to solve. Now, it's a private data point. We've moved from the torchlight to the lablight, but the shadows are still there. They've just shifted. We no longer wonder who the father is, but we've started to wonder what a father actually is. Is it the man who provided the DNA, or the man who stayed in the cave when the fire went out? The invisible chain is now visible, glowing on a computer screen in a series of digital peaks and valleys. We can see every link, every mutation, every ancient migration. But as you look at those results, remember the 10,000 generations of men who didn't have them. Remember the man in the cave who looked at a child that didn't look like him and decided to stay anyway. His ignorance was the foundation of everything you know. His uncertainty was the only reason you are here today. We have the truth now, and the truth is a powerful thing. But truth has no heart. It doesn't care who fed you or who taught you to hunt. It only cares about the code. As we move further into this era of genetic certainty, we are beginning to see the unintended consequences of our discovery. Family trees are being appended by home DNA kits. Secrets that were buried for centuries are being dug up by algorithms. The invisible chain is being yanked, and the vibrations are shaking the very foundations of how we define ourselves. We are the first humans in history who don't have to wonder, and yet, we are more anxious about our identity than ever before. Perhaps the uncertainty was a gift we didn't know we had. It was the space where love and choice could exist without the weight of evidence. So, when you think about those ancient humans identifying fathers, don't pity them for their lack of science. They had something more powerful. They had a system that allowed for multiple truths, for shared responsibility, and for the flexibility to survive in a world that was constantly trying to kill them. They didn't need a lab to tell them who belonged. They knew who belonged because they were the ones who showed up. The invisible chain wasn't a problem for them to solve. It was the thread they used to sew their world together. For 300,000 years, the human race lived in a world where the most important biological link in a man's life was a total mystery. We survived because we were willing to accept the lie, or at least the ambiguity. We built our entire civilization on the hope that the person holding the other end of the chain was who we thought they were. We finally have the truth, but we've forgotten that for 300,000 years, the lie was the only thing keeping us alive. The torches in the cave have long since gone out, and the shadows that once hid our origins have been burned away by the harsh, clinical light of the 21st century. We no longer have to squint at a newborn's face or wait for a law to tell us where we come from. The invisible chain has been laid bare, stripped of its mystery and its myth. But as you look at your own reflection or the reflection of your child, ask yourself what is more real, the sequence of molecules in your blood, or the story you've been told about who you are. We have conquered the uncertainty that haunted our ancestors, but in doing so, we have stepped into a new kind of darkness, one where facts are absolute and the ancient grace of doubt no longer exists. Our ancestors lived in a world of ghosts, but at least those ghosts were family. Now, we live in a world of data, and data has no ancestors. We have finally answered the oldest question in human history. We have identified the father. But in the process of finding the man, we may have lost the meaning of the ghost. For almost all of human history, the most powerful man on earth had less proof of his paternity than a common stray dog. He didn't have the truth, but he had a reason to stay. Now we have the truth, And we're still looking for a reason. If this dive into the deep architecture of the human family changed how you look at the people around you, there are countless more mysteries waiting in the shadows of our biology. We're constantly pulling on these invisible threads to see what else they're holding together. If you want to be here when we find the next one, you know what to do. But for now, just look at the faces of the people you love. Do you see the DNA, or do you see the story? For 300,000 years, the story was enough. We finally have the truth, but we've forgotten that for 300,000 years, the lie was the only thing keeping us alive. The verdict is in, the case is closed, and the silence that follows is heavier than the mystery ever was.